Welcome back to the Karmanos Advantage. I'm Guy Gordon, and we're exploring the power of dealing in a network and the power of teamwork. We probably beat the football metaphor to death in an earlier segment, but it does hold here that you will have a number of quarterbacks, highly talented Mahomes kind of quarterbacks in your care when you are treated by the Karmanos Cancer Institute. And that's true whether you're dealing with the center in Detroit or in one of the satellite centers throughout the McLaren Health Network. And their partnership, this incredibly unique and powerful partnership with the Karmanos Cancer Institute. Dr. Devisetty is still with us. You met him in our earlier segment. And we're joined by two people that are really in the trenches when it comes to clinical research. This is one of the most powerful aspects of dealing with Karmanos. I'm joined by Jacqueline Ventimiglia, who is works in the clinical research sphere as a coordinator or supervisor of clinical research, and Delaney Erickson, clinical research coordinator within that network. Welcome to you both.
Thank you for having us.
Talk to me about the dealings with patients when it comes to clinical research. Very often, these are people that are, their cancer may be unique. They may be, I wouldn't want to say desperate, but certainly desirous of the latest and greatest they can bring. Tell me about the mindset that they bring to it and how you respond to that.
Well, we're very lucky to have motivated physicians who are very educated on the clinical trials that we offer, and they're great advocates for their patients. So that is the patient's first step when coming into, is interested in learning about clinical trials. That physician really can provide a lot of insight, and that just kind of starts the team approach that Dr. Devisetty spoke about.
And Delaney, from your end, how do you coordinate that, and what kind of resources are brought to bear?
So from our end, I will get in daily life an email from Dr. Devisetty. I have a new patient. They seem good for this trial, and that's when it all begins. We will have a very good system where Dr. Devisetty and the NPs and the nurses can scan in documents to us, and we share the information. We're able to review the ICF for the trial, the informed consent, and then we just proceed with reading through their medical history and seeing if they're appropriate to fit onto the clinical trial.
Dr. Devisetty, what makes a good candidate for this kind of clinical research? Because I would imagine everybody wants to be part of something like that, or at least most people.
Most people do. In my personal experience dealing with patients, when you mention the idea of a clinical trial, they often get excited. One thing I do with my patients is I talk about the history of how clinical trials brought us to where we are today, and when they have the opportunity to participate in helping the future patients, they get very excited about being part of something bigger than themselves. While we are helping them, they are helping future patients. Often the excitement of the entire team is almost infectious, and when you have this team that's excited about clinical trials, the patient often gets excited as well. Not only in regards to getting access to, again, to tomorrow's treatments that we can bring to today, but just being part of something bigger.
Okay, in terms of managing expectations, who might not be a good candidate for a clinical research?
So this is one of the challenges we have in clinical trials in general. Whenever we have a clinical trial, there's often strict criteria that allow a patient to be quote-unquote eligible onto that trial or not. So not every patient will be eligible for a specific clinical trial. But what we try to do at Karmanos is to have a good portfolio, a broad portfolio of trials that gives the most access possible to our patients throughout the network. And by having this broad portfolio, we are getting more and more patients onto clinical trials.
Delaney, as you're breaking down who is eligible and who isn't, how microscopic do you go in terms of the data that you look at this? Because now we know that there are clinical trials which a simple change in a DNA code could be the difference as to whether you're eligible or not.
Yeah, I mean, wow. We go into a lot of depth when we're reading through the medical history. You have to make sure that the patient fits that criteria to a T, because something as like a heart attack that happened 30 years ago may not clinically matter right now to Dr. Devisetty, for example. However, if the trial would exclude that, it is my job to, sift through those records, find that, let Dr. Devisetty know this was found in the record from 30 years ago, and yes, unfortunately, it does make them ineligible for trial.
So you may appear to be a great candidate, but as you're also trying to manage the controllable variables, that may exclude you.
Mm-hmm.
Jacqueline, in terms of, talk to me more about the kind of patients that you interact with, and this this, I guess you would call it the zone of uncertainty, that they're not quite sure what they're facing, and how the clinical research can kind of help with them with peace of mind.
So luckily, going back to that team approach, we have research nurses that work at each of the network sites and downtown who are our experts in our face-to-face contact with our patients. So they are the ones who are also advocating for these patients on these clinical trials and providing that support to the physicians. So they really are, they're looking at the eligibility criteria with us as coordinators who are located, like Dr. Devisetty said, we're centralized downtown. So we're having phone calls with these research nurses each day to talk about patients that could potentially be eligible and whether or not they meet this criteria. So even though the clinical trials coordinators do not have face-to-face contact with these patients, we're really on the back end looking at all of their medical history, like Delaney said, to see if they're eligible with the research nurses who are the ones communicating this information directly to those patients.
Right. And how much does the peace of mind and state of mind of the patient go into whether or not they're suitable?
Oh, I think it's huge. Their mindset is, I think, makes up for, how compliant they'll be on these clinical trials. So we really need patients who are motivated to, clinical trials can often require so much, I would say most of the time, for patients. Visits, maybe weekly, a few times a week.
They're under greater scrutiny.
Absolutely. And so you need a patient to really, like Dr. Devisetty said, really be motivated to want to participate in this for themselves and for science.
And to that end, Doctor, from a resources standpoint, does it matter whether the patient is coming here from, let's say, Roscommon, or whether they're based here in Detroit in terms of the kind of resources that they have access to?
So the Karmanos mission is to make these clinical trials available at all 16 of our cancer centers. And we've invested significant resources into our infrastructure and staffing to provide that advantage at a local level. And are there certain clinical trials that are just uniquely available in Detroit? Absolutely. But we still try to expand that portfolio as much as possible to our network sites. And that led to the high rates of accruals I was talking about earlier. Clinical trials are not easy. First and foremost, it requires experience, it requires dedication, and that's the Karmanos advantage. They started at the beginning being aggressive with building an infrastructure and a culture to promote clinical trials, and we've had that disseminated throughout all 16 of our cancer centers, which is why we get so many patients on trial.
In terms of the demands on any patient for any treatment or something that involves a clinical trial, how much of this has to be done face-to-face, and how much of it, from a convenience standpoint, especially if they're a patient from out state, must be done face-to-face, or is there a telehealth application here? Talk to me about that.
So we haven't seen telehealth come into clinical trials yet, but I do think that is the way that we're going. I think that we are seeing patients come, even from out-of-state patients are coming, being referred to Karmanos for specific clinical trials. So I think with that, telehealth is definitely, it's inevitable that it'll work its way into clinical trials. There's just a component of making sure that we have the right regulatory approval to do so.
We've actually already been very successful with telehealth when it comes to our genetic counseling. A lot of these patients have family histories with strong history of cancer diagnosis. We have an excellent genetic counseling department that's based in Detroit, but we do telehealth from multiple of our network sites to meet with them so they don't have to drive to Detroit for it. So that model is there, and it will make its way into our clinical trials program as well.
And what will that to provide from a patient-focused standpoint?
So it's ease of convenience. We understand these patients are already going through so much. And if we are able to implement this telehealth program and we are able to do it more locally, it's easier for them to get through their care and deal with the often effects of treatment that come with treatment.
Dr. Devisetty, Jacqueline Ventimiglia, Delaney Erickson, thanks to all three of you.
Thank you.